our, like any kind of trainings we might have upcoming. So you can definitely check out there. If you are also, someone said they can only hear music. I'm sorry. And if you can, also, if you want to donate to Baltimore Racial Justice Action, you can find that at bemoreantiracist.com/donate. These events are actually usually free. However, it allows us, your donations allow us to continue to make these events free and make sure we can help out with the work that we're doing with the RJA. Let me make sure, can everyone hear me? Or, okay, perfect. Yep. So next slide. That's just more of where you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so just a little bit about us. Baltimore Racial Justice Action, we are a network of Maryland individuals committed to social transformation with an emphasis on racial equality, equity, and equality. So just to let you guys know, like I said, we do these events every single month. We are focusing on anti-racism and oppression, and so those topics run the gamut of just like social justice during the time of COVID, understanding and defunding the police, and of course, on events like this one, where we're focusing on Reconstruction. BRJA was founded in 2003, but we've had its roots in Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996, and we are affiliated with Fusion Partnerships, which is a 501c3. And so other than our actual 13th of the month events, we also offer some public workshops and consultations. Those are things that, like I said, focusing on the training, focusing on anti-racism. So if you're interested in learning more about those, you can usually find it at our website or on our social media. And when we'll actually, when we have those kind of starting back up, we will announce those on our social media platforms and on our website. Next slide. And once again, if you would like to donate or to become a monthly sustainer, you can follow the link at bemoreantiracist.com/donate to send a donation for this event, especially if you like this event or our other events. And you can also have an option to sign up for an automatic monthly donation. So if you want to do that this year, that will really be awesome. And you can continue to follow us for free monthly events. All right, Michelle, you have the floor.
Thank you, Julia. Before we get started with the documentary, unfortunately, we did lose a dear member of our family, Diane Leday. I considered her a mentor. She was one of our elders. She actually helped to start this great organization. And we would be remiss if we didn't take a few moments of silence in her memory. So we will do that now. Okay, so we will continue with our event, keeping Diane in our hearts and our minds with us this evening. I just want to give a little bit of background. The documentary that we're going to be watching is about the Reconstruction period. It is actually the second part of the documentary. I believe that the documentary in full is 5 parts long. Once again, it's a documentary that PBS put out. Skip Gates is the host of the event. It's a really of the documentary. It's a really well done documentary. If you get some time and you want to watch it in its entirety, it is available for free on YouTube. So just to give a little bit of background. So when the segment that we're going to watch starts, it's kind of, like I said, it's part 2. So this is a time in our history right after the Civil War, starting in 1865, and the Republicans and Republican whites in the North actually want to try to give civil rights to formerly enslaved Black people in this country. It's almost like a time of experimentation in this country. So that's kind of what's happening during the time of Reconstruction. It's a time of bringing the country back together and also of figuring out how to make Black people whole in this country after they suffered the horrors of slavery. So at this time, we're going to watch the segment of the documentary. It's about 40 minutes long. Feel free to take notes. After the documentary, we will have a few discussion questions, and then we'll discuss as a large group. If there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and get started. Oh, also feel free to turn your video off while we watch the video.
When the Civil War began in 1861, nearly 4 million Black people were trapped in bondage for life.
After the war was over and slavery abolished, Reconstruction was well underway. And although there were challenges ahead, Black people were filled with an unprecedented amount of hope.
Frederick Douglass felt triumphant. The Black man, he declared, is a citizen. The Black man is enfranchised. We live in a new world. At last, he said, the Black man has a future.
The 15th Amendment to the Constitution barred racial discrimination in voting. Black men took to the polls.
Then you see all of these Black people in charge. More than 1,500 Black officials move into positions of public leadership.
If you were an African American who had just been elected to the legislature, it was your time. The future must have seemed limitless.
Robert Smalls of South Carolina was one of these legislators. He had escaped slavery by boldly commandeering a Confederate ship and delivering it to the United States Navy, blockading Charleston Harbor. After the war, Smalls returned home to Beaufort and became one of the first heroes of Reconstruction.
Michael, tell me about your great-great-grandfather's life.
You know, society told Robert that he was less than a human being, that he was a piece of chattel, that he was devoid of higher-level thinking and strategy and planning, but he rejected all of that. The way that he commandeered the boat that was the vehicle of his freedom, in the middle of the night, putting on the top hat and the long coat of the Confederate captain. I just admire the audacity he had to steal his freedom, to seize his freedom. He was born in a shack behind the house. He was enslaved here. After the war, he comes back and he owns the place.
From being property to owning the property.
Absolutely.
He went from being enslaved to being elected as state legislator in 6 years.
He was elected to the South Carolina House and then the South Carolina Senate before going to Washington and Congress.
That is the most remarkable up from slavery story I ever heard. Once he was in office, what sort of issues were important to him?
You know, he grew up with the children of his master and would see them going to school, and it just bothered him. He thirsted for education and sought through legislation to extend that to others.
Were you insufferable among your friends when you were in school? Would you say, my great-great-grandfather was famous?
No, actually quite the contrary. I grew up in the 70s in Boston. Race was a touchy issue then with busing. In April of 1976, I was 13. I had an opportunity to unveil the bust of Robert Smalls that's here in Beaufort. That was the first time I spoke about Robert Smalls, and I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times since. Look, this is American history. Robert's story is a metaphor for this broader movement that empowered a whole race of people.
Reconstruction is a story of great expectations, enormous strides, and wrenching retreats.
Early on, in its most hopeful moments, it seemed like a revolution was taking place in the halls of Congress.
Tell me about where we're standing. What would this place have been like during Reconstruction?
So this is the old hall, the house, now Statuary Hall. In the 1870s, when the African-American members were here, there would have been vendors in here selling food and snacks as members traversed the north-south access from the House chamber over to the rotunda on the Senate side.
Tell me about the first black congressman.
First is Hiram Revels from Mississippi. He's elected to the U.S. Senate, and he comes in February of 1870, and he's celebrated as the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood, the symbolic triumph of Reconstruction. And then in December, we have Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, first African-American in the House.
How would they have been greeted?
They didn't exactly roll out the red carpet, but the door didn't get shut either. Many of the African-American members lived in the same neighborhoods that white members of Congress did. So they weren't segregated in that sense, but they oftentimes had to pay higher rents.
It's a black tax.
Essentially, yes. Imagine you have these two men who occupy the seats of former slaveholders, and they come to work in this magnificent Temple of Liberty, but it's a place that had also been constructed with slave labor.
This is an incredibly heady moment, kind of like Barack Obama becoming president. There's like 14 black men in U.S. Congress. There's 2 senators. Blanche K. Bruce's name is on money. He's signing currency in the United States.
See, all of these people served starting in the 1870s. I may be the only African-American from South Carolina now, but I am the 9th. You had the Robert Smalls, Richard Keynes, Robert Elliott, DeLarge, Rancia. So over that period of 25 years, you had real participatory democracy taking place.
The photograph of Hiram Revels highlights this statesman who happens to be African-American. Frederick Douglass recognized a camera captured the equal and essential humanity of that man or woman, black or white.
Whatever may be the prejudices of those who look upon it, they will be compelled to admit that the Mississippi senator is a man.
He is represented with the same stature as Lincoln or Seward or Grant or any other white politician. Douglass did the same thing at a time in which most whites tried to argue that blacks should not have equal citizenship. And one way of out-citizening white citizens is you portray yourself with greater sense of dignity and respectability, and in a sense humanity, than many whites.
We do not come here begging for our rights. We come here clothed in the garb of American citizenship. We come demanding our rights in the name of justice.
Richard Kane could capture an audience. I think all his years in the pulpit made him a really good speaker in the House. He stood up to the white supremacists who were basically calling him, inferior. And he said, look at me, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 ears, I have 2 hands, I have 2 feet. How are we different when it comes to our manhood?
I was amazed when I began to read the speeches of black congressmen in that period. I mean, here are people who are arguing about what the laws of the nation will provide in terms of human rights, and have a sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles that make these freedoms necessary in a democratic society. The level of discourse was so far above the level of discourse in Congress today. It was shocking.
In state houses across the South, black men and white men were attempting to govern together for the first time. In South Carolina, where African Americans made up almost 60% of the population, voters elected a black majority House of Representatives.
It was the seat of Black Power USA. The Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, State Treasurer.
Unimaginable today.
Absolutely.
Many parts of the South didn't have a educated and experienced black leadership ready to step into power, which you did have in South Carolina. It had a free black group before the Civil War in Charleston, which was well-educated and politically articulate.
Behind us lie 243 years of suffering, anguish, and degradation.
Before us lies our mighty future. That future is ours to shape.
Robert Brown Elliott was very ambitious. He was educated as a lawyer. He had a photographic memory. He was absolutely fearless.
It's hard to imagine more daunting challenges than all these governments have. Some parts of the South had really been devastated by war. So you've got to try to build a forward-looking government at a time where there are very few resources.
The state legislatures create public schools, public hospitals, public welfare systems in a way that hadn't been seen in the South.
Black men go into these legislatures with an idea of how they're going to improve their communities. One of the most important things they do is to establish free public schools.
There were no public education systems in most of the southern states. If you had money to buy it for your children, you had it. If you didn't, well, you did without.
You start to see state constitutions adopting some policy that says education is a right. And this is providing it for all children.
Across the former Confederacy, free schools opened for both black and white children. Only a few years earlier, there were laws on the books in the South that prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write.
Black people knew how much their freedom depended upon literacy. It was not uncommon to see 5-year-olds and 95-year-olds flocking to schoolhouses for a chance to learn how to read.
Free blacks realized white families are not going to send their kids to school with blacks. And so in every single state, you had separate schools. And black leaders generally said, that's okay. As long as black people get education, we're not going to try to force whites to go to school where they don't want to. And many black parents wanted black teachers. They didn't trust white teachers to be fair and to have the right attitudes for their children.
To meet this demand for teachers, governments, black churches, and missionary organizations established black colleges and universities. Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, was founded in 1866.
Let my people into this phrase. Go down, Moses. Where?
The Fisk Jubilee singers became the voice of Black Reconstruction. They introduced the world to the artistry of freed people and to the songs of their enslaved ancestors, the spirituals.
Most white people who had ever seen blacks on stage had done so in the minstrel show.
Minstrels, white men who would paint their faces black, enlarge their lips with white makeup, and spoof the African American. America found this entertaining.
But in concert after concert, first in Northern American cities and then in Europe, the singers defied expectations.
They had a decorum and a dignity on stage that challenged all of the prevailing stereotypical images that white Americans had.
These are songs of overcoming. They were about healing. They were about love. They were about the black struggle.
They allowed someone else to understand what it means to be in your world or in your shoes.
Using profits from performances, Fisk was able to buy the land on which it sits today. Fisk is one of the many historically black colleges and universities established during Reconstruction that are still educating students. Black people were also beginning to make inroads into other spheres of American life. They were buying land, setting up businesses, and becoming economically independent.
I started a farm.
I own one lot, 7 acres, another 1 acre, and another about 1/4 of an acre. I bought myself a little plantation. I bought another place, and together, that makes 98 acres.
I bought 150 acres. I have about 50 or 60 acres tended.
I rented 43 acres of land. I have a good crop in.
My husband put up an elegant blacksmith shop.
I have a son I sent to school.
It's a moment of possibility. They have reunited their families, they have formalized their unions, they have property, they have their own businesses.
The 14th Amendment had granted equal citizenship to all Americans, especially African Americans.
It was about being able to claim an American birthright, full citizenship. They saw themselves as really moving forward.
What does real equality look like? It looks like equal protection under the law.
Now, African Americans could serve as sheriffs. So they were able to go out and make arrests and bring white perpetrators in for justice.
Black people get to be judges. They get to sit on juries. They get to sign contracts in their own interest.
John Roy Lynch, a successful young businessman in Natchez, Mississippi, was appointed in 1869 as a justice of the peace.
He was born a slave in 1847 in Louisiana, the son of the plantation manager. And at the end of the Civil War, he attended night school.
As a very young man, he distinguished himself working in a photographer's studio.
He went to a few Republican meetings.
And impressed Adelbert Ames, who was the Reconstruction governor of Mississippi. Even though Lynch was only 21 years old, Ames appointed him to be a magistrate.
In his memoir, he wrote about how former slaves would bring all their problems to him as a local justice of the peace. There was a black man in this office. There had never been such a thing in Mississippi before the Civil War, and so former slaves kind of identified with him.
A case that came before me was that of a white man. He threatened the life of an old colored man over a business transaction. He remarked, "Do you mean that it's a crime for a white man to curse a nigger?" "Yes," the court replied. "It is as much a crime for a white man to curse a Negro as it is for a Negro to curse a white man." "Well," he exclaimed, "that's news to me."
You're living in this moment. You're imagining that will only get better.
In slavery, African Americans could not control their communities. And so if people are drawing on the resources that they had developed in slavery, on their sense of what it meant to have family relationships, friendships, communities, and they're able to institutionalize them in new ways.
They create fraternal organizations like the Masons that find solidarity and strength in mutual support. It's remarkable how a whole black world of their own organizations and support structures grow up and develop.
During Reconstruction, churches became the cornerstones of the black community. Many enslaved people had been forced to worship in secret or only with the master's blessing. But now, black people were free to worship God any way they wanted.
At Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, the Reverend Richard Kane helped revive a congregation that had been banned under slavery.
How did you first hear about your great-great-grandfather? Did your mother say, "You come from people"? That's what my mother would have said.
Yes,
Your great-great-grandfather was the greatest black preacher in history.
Yes, my mother and my great aunt, and they always talked about Richard Harvey Kane and the great work that he was able to do.
He was born free in what's now West Virginia, was a pastor in Brooklyn in 1965. Some people would have said, stay in Brooklyn where it's safe.
He said that he felt like a lion bound. I mean, he wanted to be here in the South and be a missionary to the newly freed slaves.
I don't think people today understand the role of the church in the 19th century. The church was their institutional universe.
Yes. The black church was the center of everything that happened with the community. The emotional, the educational, the political. Kane taught the newly freed slaves that they were no longer inferior. They could accomplish anything.
And he epitomized that.
Yeah.
He was a one-man band for the black community.
Oh, yeah.
Entrepreneur, minister, editor. Writer?
Yes, congressman, state senator.
Too powerful, too influential,
Yes, yes,
and therefore a danger.
yes. He lived in constant fear.
One of the most tragic aspects of Reconstruction is that the more African Americans achieve, the more they put their lives at risk.
I could hear the noise of the horses.
They Ku Klux my house.
They had on white gowns, masks on their faces.
75 men.
They were
Ku Klux.
They tore her clothes off.
I was blindfolded. Cut me with knives. They whipped me.
They whipped me.
Put a rope around my neck to hang me.
Southern Democrats used violence and terror tactics to disrupt Republican control and plot their return to power. They saw themselves as the redeemers of their states.
Violence is efficient, it's easy, it's fast, and you can often do it under the cover of night. Klan attacks become so pervasive because that's how widespread the fear of Black enfranchisement is.
The Klan is actually committing atrocities against everyone. They're attacking freedmen and white Southerners who were sympathetic to the Union cause and to the Republican Party.
To their eyes, emancipation was wrong. They are washing the South with blood to redeem it.
This isn't simply a question of trying to return to an earlier way of life. This is actually a political counter-revolution.
To document the violence, Congress in 1871 launched one of the most extensive investigations in our history, known as the Ku Klux Klan hearings.
The United States never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after slavery ended. The Klan hearings were as close as we came. It was extraordinary. Congress was actually listening to Black people, testifying about the atrocities committed against them.
I was elected to the legislature. They offered me $2,500 cash if I would let another man go to the legislature in my place. I told him I would not go back on my people. 65 came to my house. My little daughter came out and begged them not to carry me away. They drew up a gun and threatened her. I may say that they hit me 5,000 blows. Some of them are the first-class men in our town. One is a lawyer, one a doctor, and some are farmers. My little daughter never got over it until she died. I have never got over it yet. It broke something inside of me.
The hearings are open and public.
Women showed up at those hearings, and it took a lot of courage for them. They could face retaliations by the KKK.
But they want the world to know what had been done to them.
All the time I was planting my crop, they worried me about if they ever saw me, they would hurt me.
Whites are really attacking Hannah and her family because they had been too successful. It's jealousy. It flies in the face of the idea that Blacks are inferior.
5 men bulged right against the door. George McCrae catched the little child by the foot and slinged it out of my arms. They carried me to a pine, tied my hands there, pulled off all my linen. They said, "God damn you, you are living on another man's premises." I said, "No, I'm living on my own premises." I gave $150 for it. They whipped me from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Every time they would go off, George McCrae would get his knee between my legs, say, "Old lady, if you don't let me have to do with you, I will kill you." He said, "God damn you, I'm gonna kill you."
There are 8,000 pages of testimony given by everyday Americans. This is a haunting tale of American history and something that we don't talk about enough. Violence has always been here and goes side by side in American history to the creation of a white supremacist racial ideology that has driven us from slavery all the way to the present day.
The Union war hero, Ulysses S. Grant, had run for president under the slogan, "Let us have peace." But as reports poured in from the former Confederate states, it was becoming painfully obvious that the terror was not going to stop.
Grant didn't start out as a hero in terms of race relations. At first, he was very dubious about the fighting abilities of blacks, but he ended up becoming one of the greatest champions of recruiting and arming and equipping black soldiers. He had a remarkable record in terms of integrating blacks into the federal government.
Grant's reaction to Klan violence is a strenuous one. He makes it clear to the Speaker of the House that Congress is going to have to address the situation.
Grant was in step with a Congress that was determined to take action.
Congressman Rainey, when he was arguing for protection against the Klan, said that when he and other black congressmen left the seat of government to return home, they were at risk.
There were a couple of incidents where he and others were physically confronted on the road, and only the intervention of federal troops kept things from taking a dire turn. He had absolutely no patience listening to anyone say that maybe the Klan didn't really exist, maybe it wasn't such a big problem. Rainey would say, "Oh, I just saw them a couple of days ago. What are you talking about?" And then go on to deliver a very convincing lecture.
Saying that that violence was treasonous and the federal government had an obligation to do something about it.
Congress passed a series of enforcement acts to address the crisis, the third of which is known as the Ku Klux Klan Act.
All of which together were intended to put weapons into the hand of the federal government to directly intervene.
The 14th Amendment established that states could not deprive people of privileges and immunities of citizenship or of due process of law or equal protection of law.
So what Congress is doing in the Enforcement Act, right, is trying to create a new category of offense using the 14th Amendment to, in essence, get around the fact that Southern courts are not going to convict white Southerners.
Most importantly, the federal government can suppress habeas corpus. Where violence occurred, they can hold individuals for a crime without being charged for that crime, and they can also use the militia or the military to go in and suppress violence.
To spearhead the operation, Grant appointed Amos T. Ackerman as Attorney General of the newly created United States Department of Justice, established in the executive branch in 1870.
He supervises the deployment of federal troops to restrain violence.
Many of the Klan members that believe that they're going to be charged by the federal government begin to run away and hide.
Here is the federal government, finally taking the situation with the Ku Klux Klan in hand and directly striking back at it. The difficulty was going to turn out to be persistence.
The federal government could try to contain the violence, but it couldn't contain the spread of white supremacist ideology manifesting itself in full force.
Southern oligarchs who have held power in the pre-Civil War South for decades did not want to surrender that power.
White supremacy, an alliance between white people against black people, was always an important device that held Southern politics together.
Southern white elites knew how to activate that bond of whiteness with poor Southern whites.
And that was difficult work to do. A lot of propaganda had to go into that.
Planters in the Democratic Party have to sell white supremacy to other white Southerners who might not have the same or even any significant economic stake in white supremacy. That planters play upon racial economic rivalry. The idea that any gain by any black man deprives all white men. So they're creating a racial zero-sum fight for economic power, for government, for jobs, and promising a psychological benefit, a psychological wage of whiteness.
In 1870, When former Confederate General Robert E. Lee died, many white Southerners poured out their grief and sorrow for their fallen hero, a symbol of their so-called lost cause. It seemed that the longer Reconstruction continued, the more the former Confederates lamented the loss of their way of life.
Robert E. Lee's death became a symbolic focal point for a wrenching outpouring of nostalgia and grief.
When he died, it's like a king has died.
Bells ring throughout the South.
Schools closed.
People closed their stores.
They wore sashes and put things on their doors to commemorate his passing.
Newspapers border their entire pages with black.
They mourn him as if this is the second time they have lost the war.
In the eyes of the white South, here was a man who embodied the things that they admired the most: manly courage, Christian virtue, devotion to those underneath him, of his soldiers, and a kind of apparent paternalism toward enslaved people. And not only was Lee this perfect person, but he had been the perfect warrior. He had outsmarted the Yankees, but he was always up against larger forces. He helped create that myth at Appomattox that we have succumbed in the face of greater might. Our cause was not unjust, it just happened to have lost. It became a lost cause.
When great leaders die, or when persons die that people think of as great leaders, people are guided by emotion. As a consequence, you have this cult of Robert E. Lee developing.
And in fact, the cult of Lee had become so powerful by the 1870s that Frederick Douglass remarked that you could not pick up a newspaper nowadays without reading the most nauseating flatteries about Robert E. Lee.
The ostentatious and noisy exhibitions of sympathy and grief on the part of the rebel democracy all over the South for the man who made such Herculean efforts to destroy the government is a most painful proof that the great body of the Southern white people are far more ready to weep for the loss of a Confederate general than to sustain the government under which they live.
Douglass recognized if you rewrite the story of the war, that can have profound implications for race relations. The symbolism of Lee could become very dangerous.
The clock was ticking on Reconstruction, and the presidential race of 1872 was a test of its popularity. With black voters solidly in his corner, President Grant easily won re-election. But the campaign revealed growing fault lines in the Republican Party.
Grant faced a renegade liberal Republican movement that was critical of the mainstream of the Republican Party.
Their good government types were very upset by the scandals that had been exposed in the Grant administration.
Credit Mobilier was basically a phony company that was set up to provide financing for the Pacific Railroad project, and it laundered money. It made lots of money for corrupt individuals. The difficulty is that those corrupt individuals were often members of Congress.
Grant was personally quite honest, but he seemed blind, credulous, almost childlike to the presence of unscrupulous people.
Corruption is as American as apple pie. And if we find it in the Grant administration and the Reconstruction South, that's not because Reconstruction was inherently corrupt. It's because corruption happens. You could almost make a bumper sticker out of it.
Liberal Republicans are also adopting more of a states' rights position now. We can't just keep intervening in the South, and nominated their own candidate for president, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, a long-standing anti-slavery advocate.
really made this famous statement that he's confident that masses of our citizens, North and South, are eager to clasp hands across the bloody chasm that divides them.
The split in the Republican Party is the harbinger of a retreat from Reconstruction.
Support for Reconstruction was waning in the North, where many had grown weary from the growing cost of peace. In this environment, Black legislators became targets of scorn, ridicule, and anti-Black racist propaganda.
Derogatory images of African Americans become more and more prominent in the 1870s.
Even someone like Thomas Nast, who was a very vocal advocate for African American political rights during Reconstruction, used his artistry with Harper's Weekly to depict the African Americans in South Carolina, for example, where they have a Black majority, in the most vile ways.
James Pike, a Republican, works on the New York Tribune, publishes this book called The Prostrate State. South Carolina is under the rule of barbarism, incompetence.
He has a famous passage in which he's describing really buffoons. Those who are not buffoons are corrupt or incompetent.
He hammers again and again and again on almost animalistic stereotypes of field workers to say, really? Are these the people you want to have in charge of your government? Passing laws that suck tax dollars out of hardworking Americans? No. And in fact, we're pretty sure they shouldn't be parts of polite American society at all.
They perpetuate an idea that Reconstruction has effectively failed and that the federal government and the Republican Party needed to cut its losses and remove itself from the South. Leave the Negro to those who know him best. White Southerners.
As enthusiasm for Reconstruction dwindled in the North, Democrats felt emboldened to intensify their counter-revolution throughout the South. Year after year, election after election, they would not relent.
In 1873, amidst the fallout from a fiercely contested election in Louisiana, Black Republicans in the town of Colfax staged an armed occupation of the courthouse to prevent Democrats from taking over the Perry seat.
White paramilitary organizations surround the courthouse with artillery.
The white vigilantes offered guarantees of safe conduct. If you will come out, if you will surrender yourselves, the white vigilantes line them up and execute them. It's nothing more than pure, unadulterated murder. The United States Attorney in Louisiana, under the Enforcement Acts, is responsible for the arrest of over 100 of the white vigilantes. However, Louisiana juries turned out to be extraordinarily reluctant to convict. Only 3 convictions are obtained.
White Southerners made it difficult for the Republicans and Northerners to enforce Reconstruction policy. The organized white supremacist groups were trying to make the cost of federal intervention higher than the federal government was willing to bear.
In state after state, increasingly organized societies, paramilitary clubs, white leagues claim control of public places.
John Roy Lynch, now a congressman, was targeted when he returned home to Mississippi to campaign.
At Fayette, they paraded the streets, yelled, fired cannon. Each club had a wagon with fodder. Colored men said these wagons contained guns. Democrats had all gathered around the place. I took the stand. They commenced to yell at the top of their voices so as to drown out every word I attempted to utter.
Southern whites were attempting to take the South back. The red shirts and the Knights of the White Camellia
That's essentially what the so-called redemption movements were.
They are the ones who are defending the right order of things in civilization, that white people control black people. And that's the way it should be.
The brutal violence was accompanied by a major economic downturn, the first since the end of the war. It was known as the Panic. Banks and railroads were at the center of the storm, but soon it spread to every corner of the economy.
The Panic of 1873 has enormously destructive influences through the economy, North and South. A really devastating impact is political.
Northern Republicans lose election after election in the midterms of 1874 to Democrats who promised first to save the economy, but also to end Reconstruction in the South.
Democrats achieve a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War.
Democrats also gained control of state governments in Alabama, Texas, and Arkansas. Reconstruction's future was perilous. But the fight wasn't over. In 1874, congressional districts with majority black populations elected leaders like Robert Smalls and John Lynch. They would face stiff opposition as members of the minority party.
The Democratic majority in the House of Representatives means no more money for Reconstruction initiatives. So if there will be political troubles around election time, if the Ku Klux Klan will suddenly reawaken and begin intimidating voters at the polls, murdering black people on the roads, night riding to terrorize blacks into submission, there will be no initiative coming out of Washington.
Okay, so this time we're going to have a few reflection questions based on the documentary. I want us to take about 5 minutes to think about what we watched, reflect on the questions. I also want us to be mindful, because of time's sake, we can only watch a portion of the documentary, but because of the end of Reconstruction, Black people were basically subject to convict leasing, which means that they were picked up for very minor crimes and forced to join the chain gangs, basically put into prison for small things like loitering. They were forced into things like sharecropping. Lynching is at an all-time high after this point, after the troops leave the South. So I just want us to be mindful that this is a very painful and dark time in American history once the troops leave the South at the end of Reconstruction, due to the fact that there was so much violence from white Southern Democrats, that the government decided that it was a fight that they no longer were invested in fighting. I also want us to think about the fact that this basically plunges Black people into a very dark time, really until the Civil Rights Movement, right? So we have almost 100 years of this time of Black people basically losing the right to vote, being forced into segregation. So just being mindful of all these things as we think about the questions and we think about what we watched. So if you would like to continue to have your video off, we'll take 5 minutes to reflect on the questions and journal. All right, if we could wrap up our journaling. You're welcome to turn your videos back on if you would like to join in on the discussion. As we discuss, if you would like to put comments in the chat, feel free to do that. I know that this is a rather large group to have a group discussion, so that's always available to everyone. Would anyone like to go first in sharing some of their thoughts based on the discussion questions, reflections on what we watched, how we relate it to today? How does it relate to you personally? How does it relate to your family? While we're waiting for someone to volunteer, I'm just going to read some of the comments in the chat. Maggie shared that I'm so struck by the similarities of the role of propaganda to change political tides as today. I'm also struck by the role of economic fates then and now to turn brother against brother and the mentality of the zero-sum fate. Very good points.
I was, this is Doug Erminger. I was surprised by how short Reconstruction was. The Civil War ended in 1865, and it was in 1870 when Robert E. Lee died, and that seemed to have triggered something. And I had thought it was a longer period of time, that there was a more hopeful period of time for a longer period of time. And I also was very impressed with the fact that they were, that the new, one of the important things that the Blacks in the South did was they started public education. I wasn't aware of that. That public education is critical and to improving a person's life. And that there, I think I'd heard that there were laws, or I wasn't fully aware that there were laws that prohibited Blacks from learning how to read and write prior to that. So that was a huge step. But going back to, I thought the Reconstruction was a lot longer than that. I mean, and another thing was there were 8,000 pages of testimony in the 1871 hearings.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge documentation of what happened during that 6-year period.
Very true. Yeah, I didn't know about the KKK trials until I watched this documentary, and I have a master's in African American history. So, so yeah, I wasn't aware of that. But thank you, Doug, for your reflections.
Someone mentioned economics. There was the economic depression in 1873, and that it seems to me that played an impact on the North giving up on the South, basically. That when we have economic difficulties, we don't care about each other as much.
True.
Possibly.
Thank you, Doug.
Yes.
Did anyone else have any thoughts, reflections?
I'm just going to say really quickly, Michelle, I see the chat and, of course, there was so much, interesting information in the documentary, but I think this kind of just speaks to why Reconstruction is one of the most important times in American history, and the fact that a lot of us actually don't learn enough about it. Will that be in school or on our own? I remember when I was in school, you kind of just you didn't skip over. It was mentioned, but it wasn't talked about in depth. And I think that, especially I think before we got on the call, we were talking about, of course, like how historical today has been, just like in the last couple of weeks, in 2021, and how these things are connected. So like that, not understanding of Reconstruction, not understanding the last 4 years and the previous years before that, and how all of these things, like, what we saw last week at the Capitol, that was not like a new thing, but these types of things have been happening since Reconstruction. And so I think just watching the documentary again and watching pieces and picking up missing information, it just reminds me of how much we actually don't know, and how much a lot of us, especially folks who maybe, as I watch people speak on the floor today, don't really recognize or don't want to recognize the connection of how these things came to be. It's just simply like we put it on one person, one thing happened, the Civil War happened, and then everything was cool, or it was like a weird period, but then everything was great. And the reality is that this thing that we always talk about, democracy, it has to be constantly fought for. It's not like a simple just thing that you just have and it just works out. You've got to work for it. And they're how for a very long time, a lot of Black people have been putting in work for it a lot more than those who don't believe they belong here. Right. So where a lot of us are the walking definition of what democracy is supposed to represent, what it's supposed to be. And, we're still dealing with, a backlash because someone who was Black was president and all these other issues that continue to kind of pop up. So that's kind of what I was feeling watching the documentary.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I think something, piggyback off what you're saying, something that stuck with me from the documentary is about how this violence has continued to stay with us, right? And then watching those images as we're watching the documentary, and then you watch the news and they're like, this is un-American, this is unprecedented, but it's not, right? We're not even being honest with ourselves when we watch nightly news about who we are as America, right? And what our history tells us about who we are. So thank you, Julia, for that. Anyone else like to share? Go ahead.
Yeah, what struck me was, how much I didn't know and how much I feel like was left out of education. You learn about Reconstruction, and as far as what I learned about was that it was a period of time, and that there's not really a whole lot of depth in the education from it all. And a huge part that I felt was missing was the propaganda that states' rights pop up after the federal government gets involved. And that to me was a huge red flag that I never had been taught. We were taught state rights, and that's what the war was about. But it doesn't come up until after the federal government backs out. And so that was something that I really, really struck me.
Thank you, Amy.
Until after the government backs out. That was something that I read.
Anyone else want to share? I'm going to go to the comments.
One of the things that bothered me is I was watching television last Wednesday, most of us were, and
whoever's sharing, you're breaking up, and I can't.
Yeah. Michelle.
I'm sorry, Daniel. I think
but you might be lagging.
Yeah,
a bit.
I can't really hear what you're saying. Sorry. If you want to share in the comments or the chat box,
yeah, I can read it out.
Okay.
I'm gonna try to turn off my volume.
I think you turn off his camera. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it works better without a camera on.
It does. It's very true.
All right, so you can hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yep, we can hear you.
One of the things that struck me last Wednesday was, and I actually believe it was Senator Cruz speaking early in the day, where he was talking about how well the election of 1876 served as an example to us when they literally gave the election to Hayes over Tilden with the agreement that they would end military reconstruction in the South. Mm-hmm. And that was breached as something that was good, and that allowed for the Klan to move into the South and to gain power. That allowed Jim Crow, that allowed Plessy versus Ferguson, and that allowed up to Michael Brown, up to what's happening every day in our cities. I'm from Pittsburgh. We had a 17-year-old boy murdered a couple years ago by a policeman. And then we're using that as an example of how this election can go well. And yeah, it went well for people who look just like me, 55-year-old white men. It worked well for me, but it worked really poorly for everybody else in America. And that we haven't learned. It's 150 years and we haven't learned.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for that is also covered in the documentary if you continue to watch, about how there is this compromise that Hayes will be president and that the North will completely leave the South alone. They will not interfere at all in what they decide to do in as far as terrorizing Black people. So that was a very terrible thing that happened. And it kind of strikes me as, you know, it's like today we have what's going on in our government now. Let's not impeach Trump. Let's all just move on. Let's have unity, right? So I can't help but see the parallels between what was happening in that time in our history versus what's happening now. Would anyone else like to share?
I didn't know about Robert Small and also about Harvey Richard Kane. I think it's important, I'm an elder, and these are names I never even heard of. And to know, and the Reconstruction, and it reminded me of the 5-year-old and the 95-year-old going to get the same lesson. And I think the same thing is going on today, 2021, but it also gives me hope, and it keeps my trust in the progress that Black folks are making, because we have endured what no other people on earth not only endured, but we survived and we have been victorious. And these two names are examples of the victory that most of us don't, well, I can't talk for other people, I can only talk for myself, that I had no clue about. So I want to thank you, and I am so grateful for this opportunity to learn. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Yeah, I think that we have to be so intentional about making sure we educate ourselves about our history, because it is by design that we are not taught this, right? It is by design that we don't know really what happened during the Reconstruction period, right? Like this is to keep us ignorant of our history so that this propaganda can continue to be worked on us again as a society. So thank you for sharing that, Ms. Webster. Would anyone else like to share?
I can share some things from the chat.
Sure, thank you, Julia.
So Jenny was saying, learning so much today, and wish we can share this video to more people and to educate them about the history so they can have better understanding of the past. Absolutely. And Jen Cooper also shared, I am also struck by the white backlash. It helps me understand the pessimism of certain communities, including Black Americans, given the current events. And then Deb said, I think we have actually learned, whites in power know exactly what they're doing, and people of color have known what's been going on all along, with no power to change it and no motivation for whites in power to pay attention. And was there anything else? Yeah, I mean, I think that those comments are all absolutely true. I think that the Jen's comment about the pessimism of particularly Black Americans, I will say, like last week, first of all, I just think it's so funny that we're having this event. We talked about this event last year, and then we're talking about, because of the election, and then all this stuff happened, and then it's pretty wild.
Right.
But that pessimism that we kind of talk about last week, when we were watching, the whole the storming of the Capitol, that a lot of Black people were just like, oh, okay, well, saw this coming, and I saw a lot of pundits just I can't believe this is our country. How do we get here? And even Black pundits were looking we've been talking about this for years now, before Trump. We've been talking about this for a while. And so this is not new. I think that's what's so sad about a lot. This is not new information. So this whole then and now is there's so many parallels and similarities that that people, I think, are pointing out in these comments.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I think that for me, I think listening to the pundits and listening to people would be surprised. I'm like, so when Trump said Mexicans were rapists when he started his campaign, that wasn't violent, right? So this man has been violent. When he separated children at the border, that wasn't violent, right? So we've seen him be violent towards people of color since he started campaigning, right? And so it's only a problem, it's only an issue when the violence now affects people in the Capitol, right? That's how it felt to me listening to those pundits. So yeah. Would anyone else like to share reflections, connections to what's happening today? Lessons we can learn moving forward?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Amita. I use she, her pronouns, and also I'm brand new to Baltimore, so I just wanted to thank y'all for holding the space. I hope I'll be back.
Welcome.
I hope I'll be back. I know I'll be back. So thank you so much. One of the things I was really struck by, so as someone who identifies as South Asian American, I feel like, you know, there is this growing narrative of how much that we as a community of people of color owe to African Americans during this time, throughout all of American history, for really uplifting our own rights. But another thing that I think we have to grapple with is this idea of white adjacency. This idea that we have to be, you know, somehow like similar enough to white people, and that sort of defines our level of success and our ability to be elevated in white America. So there was a story of the Fisk Jubilee singers, which I didn't know of them, but I really loved that example. Just the fact that they were like thriving and spreading this beautiful music, but the way that they were described sort of by the speakers is that they like sort of were polished, and they presented like a version of decorum that was, I think, in line with like white culture. And that was surprising, like for whatever reason. I mean, it was surprising to white people. Simultaneously, like it just seems that when they talked about Robert E. Lee later, they said that he had this idea of paternalism towards people of color, and in that case, like formerly enslaved African Americans. So it just seemed like something that I'd love to discuss further if there's space for it, is just this idea that like so much of the identity is policed here, but that it's also so circumstantial. Like it will continue to be a zero-sum game of financial and political gain, even if you're, you know, like, even if you're like polished and decorum and you have like that decorum, you know, it just seems like such a double-edged sword in so many ways, but also the only ticket to being accepted by white America. I just felt like that was really just a chunky underlying thing that I kept noticing, and it really bothered me because that is enduring, much like these political struggles that we're discussing.
Thank you, Amita. Welcome to Baltimore. Yeah, I think that there is this very long history, right, of Black people feeling like they have to prove that they're good enough, right? We have a very long history of every time there's a war, Black people enlist to fight in those wars, right? Because I want to show that I'm an American and you know and that I deserve to be here, and that is just a very it's a theme that we see a lot as far as the African American community. I think fairly recently there's been pushback by Black people saying that I don't have to look a certain way or talk a certain way or wear my hair a certain way to have, you know, I don't have to do this thing of having proximity to whiteness to prove that I belong, right? I think there's a very recent pushback on that, but that is definitely very much a theme in African American history. So thank you for pointing that out, Amita. Anyone else want to share? We have about 10 minutes left.
I wanted to just say something about just on the theme of violence and how, you know, I posted this in the chat a little bit up, I think around maybe I shouldn't bother to find it, 7:37. There's a New York Times update about a document that federal officials put out that's kind of warning you know, at the state level, at the city level, as well as at the federal level, that we're probably going to see more violence. And one of the things that really got driven home for me in this past week was how abusers, you know, also rely on violence when they're challenged, especially when they're not getting their way. And the theme of like holding power and not wanting to share power, especially, you know, white supremacist power, not wanting to let it go, not wanting to give it up, and like an abuser, you know, like it's just swatting and you know, flailing and using, you know, batons and using guns, using weapons, anything, you know, this kind of desperation to keep it, to hold on to that power. And you know, I also just want to say, like, I personally, I like this question. You guys always have such good questions. How does this history relate to you personally? You know, like, I, as a woman, fear violence a lot, you know, and I'm scared, you know, like, I see a group of white men, generally I'm a little bit of scared, you know, like if I think that they're like from a fraternity or something, I keep my head down. But now, you know, I just like keep my head down pretty much with anyone. I don't even know who to trust anymore. It's really getting to me right now. Anyway, thanks for hosting this.
Thank you, Eleanor. Yes, I was also struck by, what I was struck by that was talked about in the documentary was the way that the people who had decided to use violence to change, like our government was trying to move us in a certain direction, right? We were trying to incorporate Black people into society, give them some political power, and that white Southerners were so persistent, right? Like they were so persistent in their violence. And I definitely see parallels to that today. People want to think that, you know, when Trump leaves office, this is all over. I don't think it is going to be, right? And one of the lines that stuck with me from the documentary was that this was a political counter-revolution, right? This violence was a political counter-revolution. And that is exactly what's happening now. There is a historical precedent for those people who stormed the Capitol getting their way, right? So I think that we should think about the fact that we have to remain vigilant in you know, dismantling racism and white supremacy, because the people who want to keep it in place, they are persistent. They have a lot invested psychologically, emotionally, financially in keeping this system in place, right? And so if we are to be doing the work of dismantling, we have to be persistent as well. So that's just something that kind of stuck with me.
Absolutely. I mean, the other part is like, you know, that persistence is, of course, continuing to stay engaged and be educated about how we either fight back, how you, of course, if you are, unfortunately, when you're around certain people, we don't like push back on certain topics. These are all things that I think we can all do on a daily basis to challenge ourselves and challenge those around us. Because here's the thing, it's like, you know, these things are not going to change if people continue to feel comfortable. Like, I think that, you know, with, like I said, the storming of the Capitol was interesting because a few months ago we saw like a very similar group of people try to like kidnap like the governor of
Wisconsin,
like Michigan.
Michigan.
It was Michigan. And I think, I mean, like now we kind of see it, you see it on paper, you see it as linear, right? It's like history is very rarely linear. There's all these little offshoots that we don't know about. It's a lot of points of view that we aren't taking into consideration. And so listening to those people, challenging our instincts and our belief systems is a daily process, you know, and so just making sure that maybe for 2021, making that a goal of like, you know, if you haven't watched this documentary, maybe it's, you know, watching it on your spare time. Maybe it's getting some books on Reconstruction. Maybe it's, you know, like talking to people in your family, you know, who might have some information. Because I know a lot of us like have family members who've kept documents and have stories that are passed down. How does this really relate to you? How have you benefited from this? How has this harmed you? I think it all is important for us to take those things into consideration when we're trying to create a better world, because a better world does exist, but we have to create it and we have to have the information in order to do it.
Thank you, Julia. We have about 5 minutes left. Does anyone else want to share?
My name is Jenny Henry from Woods Church. I learned a lot today, and this is very powerful. Also, I think that really strikes me is that how the bad types of media really influence people a lot, enticing people. Back then, the newspaper are owned by white people, so they were easy to use the newspaper as their media to enticing their people, to brainwash their people. So nowadays, we have a lot of social media that are corrupting people's minds. So we really need to monitor all those bad media and watching who is behind all this, spreading all these rumors about, the injustice, whatever. It just really, we need to take out those, the right-wingness, the radical people, take out their media so they cannot, further to influence people on their words.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's very difficult. I know like the app Parler, I know was taken off of social media. But we have news outlets like Newsmax, who are even more to the right of Fox. And I think that it's just going to be very difficult to stop this news media, unfortunately. I think that Fox News has made it okay to like literally give people completely incorrect information. So yeah, I personally don't see how we stop that. I think even in the documentary, it said something about that the spread of these ideas. We can stop actions a little easier, but right, but like the spread of the ideas is much harder to contain.
And even more that I've also like found that a lot of that information, like the kind of conspiracy theories and like the far right stuff, a lot of stuff is easier to get. Like it's not behind a paywall for you to read those articles. It's freely spread versus like maybe, like an NPR, NPR doesn't actually have like paywalls, but like other companies that, you might, want to read like a long form article on, a lot of those things like have paywalls, a little bit harder for you to get that information. So just like even the info that we get and how we get it is just like impacted by the economics and the racism, like that we kind of like see, that we're kind of that's built in to the system.
Right. We have time for maybe one more person to share. Edna, did you want to share?
Yeah, I just would like to bring.
Oh, you're on mute. You were off mute and then you muted yourself again.
Okay. To bring in the same inability of the people here or the government to take control of the guns in private possession, even after children were shot in schools and churches and synagogues were traumatized, the inability of the psyche of the people here to say enough is enough, no more guns in private possessions. And now those guys are running in DC, which should be like, in my opinion, there should be no guns at all because it's not even a state. It's kind of like at the Vatican for the Catholics,
Mm-hmm.
But the inability, the kind of paralyzed will not to be able to act on it. And those are the same, it's the same force, it's the same, tribe of people who will go and make other people suffer so much as the Black people in America had to do and still do. And the same that stormed the Capitol and the same that, that own all those guns. I mean, who are those people that shoot in clubs or in dance festivals or in schools or in churches? That's the same mindset. Anyway.
Yes, in America we have, I don't even know where to start about our unhealthy obsession with guns and violence. I mean, I would say this. I think that unfortunately, this country is rooted in violence, right? Like our very inception of this country taking people from their homeland, killing Native peoples who were already here, right? Like it was an incredible amount of violence that went into starting this country. And I think, unfortunately, that because violence has been embedded in our culture from our very beginnings, it's a thing that we're still infected with, right? It's just, it is who we are. So that's, I don't even know what else to say about the guns.
May I
But
say
I think
something really
violence is
quickly?
I think somebody else was trying to speak.
I just wanted to say something really quickly, pushing back against what that lady said. So my name is Raina. I'm from Baltimore originally. I have to push back against what you said about guns as a Black woman, only because there is a history of Black gun ownership in this country being very important in our self-defense. And having strict gun control, it affects us in a more negative way than a positive way. You know, when you take away, when you have strict gun rights, we're more affected in a negative way than in a positive way. It's not going to prevent violence being enacted on us. It's going to stop our access to our means of defense. And that's I have to push back on.
Thank you, Raina. That is a very valid point. There is a book called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed that I highly recommend. It talks about how even though Martin Luther King preached nonviolence, his people around him were armed. The Colfax incident that was referenced in this video is also talked about. Those were, Black men who decided we're going to protect our people and their right to vote. Unfortunately, it ended very badly for them, right? But there's a very long history, actually, of Black people in this country arming themselves because of white vigilante. And that is a valid history, and that is an important history. So thank you, Raina, for that point. It is now 8:02, and we said we'd be done by 8 o'clock. I know that this is a topic that we probably could continue to talk about a lot longer. We may end up doing a part 2 at some point this year. So stay tuned for that. Dana, if you could put up, okay, thank you, Dana. I just encourage you all to continue to stay connected to us through our social media. We are a nonprofit, so we do appreciate donations so that we can continue to do the work that we do, not only our 13th of the month events, but our workshops and our consultation work. So we definitely appreciate any and all donations. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Like I said, I very much encourage you all to go back and watch the documentary in its entirety since it's free on YouTube. I think it's a great learning tool. And I thank you for joining us on your Wednesday night. I know there's lots of things that people could have been doing, but thank you for coming and learning and being a part of the discussion. And with that, we'll go ahead and close. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.